Welcome to Stories from the Top. I'm your host, Lance Tanaka, and I'll be interviewing successful executives from the best of the best global companies about leadership and their journey. If you want to grow your business, you need to listen to today's guest, Peter Winick. Peter's the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage. For the past 2 decades, he has helped individuals and organizations build and grow revenue streams through designing and growing their thought leadership platforms, as well as acting as a guide and advisor for increasing business-to-business sales of thought leadership products. He also leads a program in strategic planning, providing you a roadmap to success. So this is, I'm really looking forward to, talking to our guest today, Peter. So welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Lance. I appreciate it.
Sure. Did I miss anything? Anything else you want to tell about yourself?
I'm curious to see. I was enjoying the introduction and curious to see what I have to say. It sounds interesting.
Okay, we're all looking forward to it. We're all curious. Okay. Well, let's start off. In the book Stories from the Top, I share about the 8 common leadership challenges facing leaders, and it transcends culture, country, level, industry. Yep. And the number one challenge is around finding your purpose and becoming an authentic leader, essentially being the person or leader you were designed to be. So, you're living your dream, you're living out your purpose. Yep. So if you could share with my listeners, what was your journey? How did you get to this point?
Yeah, so the journey's interesting. Well, I don't know if it's interesting, but my earlier days, always entrepreneurial. I mean, going back to, in school, always, the kid that figured out you can buy a pack of gum and sell 5 pieces to your friends and make double your money or something, right? So always that intrigue and the entrepreneurial, hustling, doing whatever you can to generate cash, not so much from, need or desperation. I mean, not that I grew up, privileged, but there was something rewarding about whether it was waxing someone's car or whatever it was and getting paid for it. And I always felt that the dollars that I earned felt better than the ones my parents gave me to go buy things with or go to the movies with for some reason. So I don't know if that's a discussion for here or a therapist or some combination thereof. But so the early career, always entrepreneurial, started businesses, built businesses. But when you start your first business, as I did, and I think I was 22 or 23 back in the 1800s, you're underfunded, right? You don't know what you don't know. And if your older self, like if I look at myself today and say, would I have made the bet that I made at 23, essentially going sort of all in, I'm like, oh my God, no, probably not, because all in now means something else. But so always entrepreneurial. But the other side of me, and this is where it comes to the purpose piece, I think, is before we called it thought leadership, it was called being a nerd, right? Like that's what it was called, right? So I was always reading books, reading magazines, sort of this insatiable curiosity, this insatiable appetite, this now we would call it lifelong learning, right? And when you're an underfunded entrepreneur, you don't even know that there's consultants out there to pay to help you solve your problems. And even if you did, you couldn't afford them anyway. So to me, I'd be like, you buy a book or read a magazine, go, oh, someone else has had this issue of their employees not doing what you'd like to do or not being motivated. Someone else has had this issue of not understanding what the margins are in their business. Wow, I can learn from them for the price of a book or magazine. This is really awesome. But I always thought they were 2 totally distinct sides of a coin. There's Peter the entrepreneur and Peter the nerd, right? And then, fast forward many years later, probably 2003, 2004. So many years later, I was sitting at that point as a COO of a boutique consulting firm that focused on startups and small businesses. So essentially, business plans, helping them get funding, helping them grow. And I always like building things, right? And occasionally we'd come across a client that was broken, and it was more of a turnaround situation. And we never did any turnaround work. So one of the things that we did do is we found a strategic partner to help the folks that needed turnaround work. And I became friends with the guys that owned that firm. And one day, the founder called me and said, "Hey, why don't we go have a drink?" Okay, cool, that's fine. So we go to have a drink, and he said, "Well, we had this client that we're doing some turnaround work with, and they actually bought our firm, and we're now the CEO and the CFO of that company. Why don't you come on board with us?" And I'm like, "Well, what do they do?" And they're like, "Oh, well, what they do is they're in the training and development space." I'm like, "I have the attention span of a flea. I think that's the most boring business in the world. Why would I possibly want to spend my time doing that?" And they walked me through the backstory. It was basically a company that was built 45 years before based on some IP, a book that someone wrote in the 60s. So, now the light bulb goes off like, oh, that's interesting, right? And it was more about the opportunity to work with two folks that I really admired and respected than a passion for the training industry, right? And I went in and realized that there's this whole world of thought leadership, which is really, and I think where I found my groove is a pretty good entrepreneur and a nerd from early on. I'm like, I never ever thought about the business side of thought leadership, and I think most people don't, Lance. You buy a book from someone and you read their stuff and you go, that's really cool, but have you ever, in all the business books that you bought, sat and said, how does Tom Peters make a living? What's Seth Godin's business model? Like, you don't do that. I do that all day now because it's my world, but there's a whole universe of that, and it enables me to apply my creativity as an entrepreneur, not in terms of developing thought leadership, but by saying, how do we get this out into the market? Who's going to value this the most? What are the formats and the modalities? So, the long-winded answer to your question is when those two worlds collided, and I was the only one that kept them separate, right? Like realized like entrepreneur with a passion for content, thought leadership, being a nerd, whatever it was, like, why can't I apply one to the other? It was sort of it should have been strikingly obvious many years before, but for whatever reason it wasn't. So I would throw out to your guest, are there two or three things that really, really jazz you, but you keep them separate? I have clients that are world-renowned keynote speakers that are also improv comedians. Like, that's interesting. They can integrate some of that, A into B. Like, what are the places that you've put up fences in your world that what would happen if you took them down?
An LT observation. Peter always separated his serial entrepreneurialism and his nerd knowledge. But then at some point he really realized, why not bring them together? Yeah, because you have many strengths and passions and you need to integrate them. That reminds me of a principle that we use in our business is around this concept of true north versus north. And true north is, this is it. This is the thing I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. And, there it is. But there's a lot of problems with that. I think you're kind of describing north in that you can have multiple things in your north, the things that you need, that you love to do, that you're good at doing, and you can integrate them. And that's what I think that's what you're talking about is integrate. In this case, it was two things, but probably if you look deeper, you've probably integrated a number of things together to create what you have now.
Well, I also think the labels that you either put on yourself or others have put on you could be limiting constraints. Oh, Lance is a good finance guy. Okay, so therefore I've limited the place that you have value to finance, or Lance is a tech guy, or whatever that is. And I think sometimes you have to question the labels that have been put on you or you put on yourself, even when they're good labels, right? Like, hey, he's a great business guy. I'm looking at you now and I see guitar in the background. So I'm assuming, Lance probably likes guitar.
Good
right?
assumption.
Right?
Yeah.
But interesting, right? I see a football. I don't know if you're a football player, but there are other elements of your life that you've got, sitting around in the office there that are obviously important to you, or a part of you that others might not be privy to.
Yeah. This thing that you brought up about labels is that, others have expectations or perceptions of you, which may not necessarily be in your best interest. And when I work with people who want to be entrepreneurs, they hear from their friends or their parents or their whatever saying, well, that's not very practical, or that, wow, that's a big risk, or that's not GE, a well-known company. It's not.
Well, I can't tell you how many, not just friends, but clients as well, that often introduce themselves as, I'm a recovering ... accountant, attorney. And then you say, that's, they sort of say it in a lighthearted way. And I always ask them, well, why did you become an accountant? Why did you become an attorney? Because that's not something that you do quickly. I mean, there's years of education, there's years of focus, and a lot of times it's, well, that's what I thought I was supposed to do, or I was going to please my parents, or I was on track, I was good in math and went to accounting, and it was just logical and linear. And they never stopped and paused and say, do I want to live the life of an accountant or a lawyer? Not that those are necessarily bad lives, but is it the life that you want to live? Because you can be wildly, I mean, I've met folks that are off the chart successful as lawyers, but they're miserable, they're empty, they're like, oh. And then you get stuck at a point where, I'm such and such an age, I got kids, I got mortgage, I got college expenses, I can't give this up because I'm getting paid so much and I can't reset at 45 or 50 or whatever.
Well, any kind of advice you would give to somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur? I mean, you're a serial entrepreneur. You've done many different things. What's the advice you would give to somebody who's saying, yeah, this is something I'd really like to try?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So there's two types of advice I would give them. Number one is careful what you wish for, meaning, I think there is this, I think it's a very American thing, this glamorous, sexy, everybody's Zuckerberg or blah, 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 blah. And I think it's do your homework, right? So for example, if you're a mid-level corporate person, maybe in your early 30s, mid 30s, and you're making $70,000 a year. So I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to go do X, right? Great. First, do a little bit of math, right? Because what I found is people that have spent their careers in corporate don't realize that it's not just the 70K a year. It's probably costing fully loaded north of 100 to keep you on the books, benefits, insurance, FICA, all this sort of stuff. So, okay. So now to break even, you have to generate net $100,000 in your business that you're pursuing, whatever that is. You really know what it's going to take to do that. And there is a fallacy of freedom as an entrepreneur. You're answering to lots of people, suppliers, vendors, customers, your employees, your contractors, cash flow. And until you really, and I don't mean you have to study it to the 11th degree, but don't just go all in, because I think it's irresponsible when you're not aware of what's the downside. And the downside could be you fail. That's okay. But does fail mean you're going to be homeless, or does fail mean, geez, it might take me another 5 years to get the down payment on the house I wanted to buy? So as long as you're comfortable with the with the downside and all that. And then the other thing is, don't be an entrepreneur because someone else is telling you. Like if you go to, Thanksgiving and show up with a pumpkin pie and your Aunt Tilly says, oh my God, Peter, that's the greatest pumpkin pie I ever had. You should be in the pumpkin pie business. Well, okay, thank you, Aunt Tilly. But, just because I can bake a pie doesn't mean I can brand it, market it, sell it, manage supplies, manage employees, understand retail. I mean, there's 1,000 things that you need to do. Baking the beautiful pie is but one. And I think people forget that, and they think, oh, well, everybody loves my pumpkin pies. So, loving them and, will you sell enough wholesale, retail, whatever to make a living is a totally different thing. And I think when you dive into it just from the passion without the discipline, it's somewhat irresponsible.
An LT observation. Being an entrepreneur is great, but Peter does give you a warning. And he says, okay, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you need to be careful what you wish for. In other words, you've got to do your homework, got to research. It's also understanding that you got to combine your passion with discipline. Now you've been an entrepreneur way in the past, and then you've been one more recent. Have you seen any changes in approaches to being an entrepreneur, or different challenges that you have to face now that you didn't have to face in the past?
Well, so the first business I built in my early 20s, where that's evolved, not my business. I mean, that industry became what is now sort of Grubhub, right? Multi-restaurant food delivery. Now, when I did this in the early 90s, it was a fax machine. There was no internet, right? It was a mail order business, meaning we had to print hundreds of thousands of catalogs to mail to people at homes to say, "Ooh, I can do." So the complexities and the hiring of staff. And one of the things I realized after I sold that business 9 years later, is I don't want a heavy operations business anymore. I had 100 and some odd employees in my 20s. I don't want that again. Like I just didn't want the headaches and the stress. I mean, it was, and even though it was a 7-day-a-week business, we weren't 24 hours a day, but I slept with the beeper, and something was always happening. And literally woke up every morning for 8 years, first call to the bank to see what the account looks like, how much did American Express deposit, blah, 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 knowing what money had to go out the door, and that, and a big jar of Tums on my desk. And the business was successful, but I don't want that again. So when I started what is now Thought Leadership Leverage many years ago, I'm like, okay, I actually went too far the other way, Lance, which is funny, which is, you know what? I don't want any employees. It'll just be me. I'm going to be a solo dude and I can make a great living and I don't need anybody. Right. And that was great until I realized like, okay, well, it's great, but A, I'm kind of lonely. There's far more demand than I can supply and I can grow a business, but it doesn't have to be 150 people, 4 offices, all these moving parts and all that. So I was very deliberate and probably a little bit late to the game and expanding the team and doing all that because I was gun shy or a little PTSD from having maybe a little too much too early. So now we're small. We're a boutique firm, 10 people. It's a great size. We're virtual. So this concept of going to the office this is a pre-COVID thing. I designed like, what would I like? How do I want this to look? And was able to do that.
Okay. Well, yeah, you've got all these people that are quitting their jobs now because they have to go back to the office. So you'd be a great a great source to go look for a job for you.
Well, and that's a huge. I've always played the talent arbitrage game, right? So the fact that I'm in New York, if everyone I hired lived in New York, I'd have to pay them a hell of a lot of money. And there's a arrogance or a hubris for people to think, well, there's only smart people in New York. No, there's not, you dummy. I have people that work for me that are awesome that live in Canada. I have someone that lives in I'm drawing a blank, Iceland. I have someone in Texas. Someone like geography is a limiting piece, and when you can arbitrage that labor and also give people the lifestyle they want to do work that they love in a place that might not have as much opportunities, that's awesome.
Well, I'd like to move on to another topic. You work with executives on strategy, and I would imagine in many cases you're going to face CEOs or C-suite people that say, "This is the way we've done it. This is the way we're always going to do it." I'm sure at times you got to deliver news about, "Hey, you got to make a change," or "You're going the wrong direction," or "You need to move in this direction." What's that like? Because these are not the easiest people to convince.
Yeah, so our client base is, authors, thought leaders, CEOs, consulting firms, et cetera. And the businesses are businesses that are based on thought leadership. So we're not going into, Eli Lilly telling them, no, your drug strategy is wrong. However, they all own and run their own businesses. And, we tell them up front, listen, I am not the consultant that's going to tell you that even though your kid is cross-eyed, has big ears and freckles, is going to be a supermodel. We're going to tell you, look, this is an ugly baby and it's not going to be a supermodel. There are other alternatives here, but stop it. So we're not blunt for the sake of, being offensive, but I don't think we're being in service of our client to say, oh, you know what? Yeah, everything you've produced is the smartest thing I've ever seen. No, or a client comes to us and they've been fiddling around for 10 years and they're at a certain level and they get a little stubborn or arrogant. Well, this is the way we've always done it. I'm like, okay, well, if you're happy with the results, keep doing what you're doing. But we're working together because we're looking for a different outcome or a better outcome, or not that what you're doing is a failure or doesn't work, but if it hasn't gotten to you to where you aspire to be, and you're not willing to at least be open-minded enough to consider other possibilities and other paths, then stop whining about it.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's all it is.
Yeah. This gets me to be thinking about, I was talking about the stories from the top book. The number one challenge of leaders is around authenticity, finding your purpose. Number 4 is what we call you can teach an old dog new tricks. There's that American saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? I'm set in my ways. This is the way I'm going to do it. And I would have imagined you're going to face this a lot because you're going to be working with people who've been there, right?
I would say if you're a dog that doesn't learn new tricks, you're a dog that's going to starve to death, period. We're living in a time now where the speed of change, be it, even if you're not in the technology space, you've got your 87-year-old grandma now on FaceTime, right? And doing Zoom calls. Like, that's a pretty cool thing. So I think if you're not committed to lifelong learning, a lot of people, if you look at the data, the average American reads something like less than 2 to 3 books a year. That's pathetic. That's really sad. And they think like, oh, I got my undergrad or my MBA, whatever. The education part of my life is over. Now I just do. But I was reading an article not long ago, I can't remember where it was from, but that by the time an undergrad graduates with an engineering degree, so senior, 40% of what they learned is outdated. Not physics. Physics is physics, right? So if you're not committed to lifelong learning, if you're not committed to micro learning and unlearning, right? So it's not just the adding, but what do I need to take away, right? Like, if you might have been a master at the direct mail business, not that that business has gone to zero, but if you chose to stay there and not learn email marketing, for example, you're a dinosaur.
An LT observation. If you're a dog that can't learn new tricks, you're going to starve. You need to be committed to lifelong learning as well as unlearning. Yeah, I was reading about the high tech firms. In the past, they were hiring people based on their degree and their tech, their engineering background, and they now starting to shift, and they're starting to talk to people about, can you be innovative? Can you work with people? Can you communicate? Because what they've realized, all that learning, all those 4 years or 8 years in college, it's obsolete now because things move on, right? So yeah, can you
And
unlearn
especially
and relearn?
And I think the more technical your foundational education, the more obsolete, the higher at risk it could be obsolete. Things like critical thinking skills, listening skills, emotional intelligence, they evolve. They don't become obsolete.
Yeah. So can you talk about either a situation or your approach to when you're working with these executives and they've got to relearn something or redo their strategy or go a different direction? So, the old dog, teaching him new tricks. How, what's your approach to that?
Yeah, I think you just need to state your case and not force it on them. So I think one is there's probably a self-selection bias. People that come to work with us are at some degree open-minded, right? Because it's folks that don't, I can figure this out on myself. I'm a smart guy or gal, whatever. So I think my sample, the world that I work in, is probably a little biased from a self-selection piece. Like, quite frankly, why would you retain someone to help you think about a strategy to change the way that you do things if you're closed-minded? So it's not that it doesn't happen, but I think it's more about changing of the mindsets than a business process or something, right? If you have a fixed mindset around something, I trust. No, I have to micromanage my employees because you can't trust those damn people, like whatever. Okay, well, if you don't change that, that's not a place I want to live, right? Once you change that and say, ooh, I could now be more transparent with the data, or I can, live in a results only work environment. I can get rid of the office. I can, think about where lack of trust is a constraint to the growth of the business and your own personal satisfaction.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that you made about selection. Especially as a new entrepreneur, you're focused on trying to get revenue. So I'm going to get as many clients as I can. But if you get the wrong ones, that might create a bigger problem in the future.
So that's an amazing point, Lance, because so in my world is professional services. So it's not like I'm selling you a widget and there's never going to be an interaction again, right? So way early on, years and years and years ago, not that we would take on anyone, but we're so happy to get a client that we weren't as discerning and go, oh, do we want to work with that person? Now I've got, I don't know if it's like my spidey radar or my instincts or whatever. I can tell early on if someone's going to be, I'm like, I'm always doing the calculus in my head going, that person, do I want to spend the next 90 or 180 days with that person? They annoy me. They're combative. They're just, they're dismissive. Like, I call it leasing a problem. 90 days from now, I just leased myself a problem and there I go. So I have, now luckily I'm at a point in my life and my career where I'm not desperate. We want to always grow the business, but if someone comes across and I get the bad vibes, I don't need to tell them, hey, Lance, you're a jerk. But there are ways to politely say, this might not be a fit. And sometimes, I don't know, but I want to work with you. I'm like, no, it has nothing to do with you. I don't think this is a fit for us. And it might be, sometimes it's not, you might remind me of my third grade history teacher that I hated, but it's usually much deeper than that. It's usually, there are things that you can tell early on. If someone has no respect for your time, they're 15 minutes late to every call. If they're condescending to those around them. If you say, oh, well, I've hired 7 other consultants before and they're all idiots. And then you go, well, clearly I'm going to be the 8th. Why do I want to set myself up for that? So I think it's wonderful to be in a place where when someone's going to be difficult, you can choose not to. I think earlier on in your entrepreneurial journey, either you're blind, you're so enamored that someone thought of you enough to pay you, or you haven't developed those capabilities to say, ooh, do I want them to be a client?
Yeah, but I think that's a critical point, especially with new entrepreneurs, because yeah, there's that, there's that thing, I got to get the client, and regardless if I like them or not. But if you don't click, I can see where the results aren't going to be so good, and that's what you need to live on, right? You need to live on, hey, I deliver great results for these
But
clients,
I
so
was,
now
yeah, I
that's
mean, I'll
how I
give you an
get new
example.
ones.
I was advising a client earlier this week who we were reviewing an agreement she had with a potential client that wanted to bring her on in a very limited role. And there was discrepancy over the compensation rate, the day rate. And she brought that to their attention. We talked about how to do that. And the answer from the client side was, well, just lie. Just, put more time on your timesheet. If you don't like the day rate, just put in 2 days for every day that you work. She said, I'm not going to do that. And by the way, I don't want to work with anyone that's acceptable to do that. Like, I will not do that. I've never done that. I'm not going to do that for you. And thank you, no, thank you. I don't care if you're going to now agree to my rate. You're not people I want to work with. Like, and now some people might say, geez, I had to take the deal. I needed the money. Whatever. That client's in a position where she can afford to say that, right? And I think those are the type of things that we look at and say, do you really want to be in bed with those people? I mean, it's your reputation. So anyway.
Oh, great advice. Great advice. All right, Peter, thank you. What's the best way for people to be able to learn more about you and contact you?
Yeah, if you put a check in the mail for $1 million with my name on it, you'll get my attention. Short of that, you can email me. It's peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on whatever, Twitter, all the social sites. But the best place is just email me directly, peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Peter Winick, founder, CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage. You want to grow your business? This is the guy you need to talk to.
Thank you, Lance.
Thanks a lot, Peter.